Close your eyes for just a moment. I want you to try and remember a very specific sound from your past. It is the rhythmic, heavy turning of a manual can opener cutting through tin, followed by the sharp sizzle of ground beef hitting a hot cast-iron skillet. Can you smell it? That rich, savory aroma of onions, tomato sauce, and simple spices drifting down the hallway, calling you home before the streetlights even flickered on. Welcome back, my friend. Today, we are going to take a slow, comforting walk down memory lane. We are going to look back at 20 frugal dinners we ate without money in the 1980s that we secretly miss with all of our hearts. These were the meals born out of necessity, crafted with tight grocery budgets, yet they were served with an abundance of love. By the end of this journey, we will remember a meal so simple, so profoundly humble, that it just might bring a warm tear to your eye. So, sit back, relax, and let us travel back to a time when our dining rooms were the center of our universe. Before we dive into those wonderful, bubbling casseroles and savory skillets, let us remember how different the world felt back then. Time simply moved slower in the 1970s and 1980s. There was no constant buzzing of smartphones, no rushing through a drive-thru just to eat in isolation behind the steering wheel of a car. Dinner time was a sacred anchor at the end of a long, tiring day. When our parents came home from work, often exhausted and carrying the heavy burden of providing during tough economic times, the kitchen became a sanctuary. You would hear the evening news playing on the television in the living room, the serious, steady voices of the news anchors blending with the clatter of silverware and plates being set on the table. We did not have a lot of money, and we certainly did not have access to gourmet, exotic ingredients. But let me tell you a secret that modern society seems to have forgotten. We were not poor in spirit. In fact, we were incredibly rich in connection. The lack of distractions meant we actually looked at each other. We listened to our siblings recount their day at school. We watched our parents share a quiet, knowing smile over a steaming plate of inexpensive food. The limitations of our wallets sparked an incredible, loving creativity in the kitchen. We are not just mourning the loss of these vintage recipes today. We are longing for the beautiful, undivided human connection that was served right alongside them. Let us begin with a meal that defined the chaotic, joyful energy of a busy weeknight, the classic Sloppy Joe. Do you remember the distinct, rhythmic sound of the heavy metal can opener turning? That click, click, click as it cut through the tin, releasing the rich, tangy aroma of tomato sauce, molasses, and sweet spices. In the 1980s, Sloppy Joes were an absolute cornerstone of our weekly dinner rotation. Mom would stand by the stove, browning a single pound of cheap ground beef in the heavy skillet. The sizzle of the meat hitting the hot pan filled the kitchen with an earthy, savory scent that promised a good, filling meal. She would stir in that iconic can of Sloppy Joe sauce, or maybe her own secret frugal blend of ketchup, brown sugar, and a dash of sharp yellow mustard. We would watch eagerly as the mixture bubbled and thickened, turning into a beautiful, messy stew. The buns were always the most affordable white hamburger buns from the grocery store, incredibly soft and squishy, waiting to be piled high. When you took that first hungry bite, the sweet and savory meat would inevitably spill over the edges, landing on your plate or your sticky fingers. It was a dinner that required no formalities, no fancy silverware, just a tall stack of paper napkins and a hearty appetite. We never thought about how little it cost to make. We only knew that it tasted like a feast, a warm and sloppy embrace after a long day of playing outside in the neighborhood. It was the kind of meal that made you feel incredibly safe and completely at home. Now let us think back to the beloved tuna noodle casserole. If there was ever a dish that defined making something out of absolutely nothing, it was this warm, bubbling baking dish. The ritual usually began with opening the wooden pantry door and searching for those reliable staples that were always sitting on the shelf. You would hear the familiar crinkle of a cellophane bag of wide egg noodles, followed by the clanking of a can of condensed cream of mushroom soup and a small tin of chump-light tuna. The magic was in the simple assembly. Mom would boil the noodles until they were perfectly tender, then mix them together with the thick soup, the drained tuna, and perhaps some frozen green peas to add a little splash of vibrant color. It all went into a heavy glass casserole dish, but the absolute most important step was yet to come: the topping. Do you remember taking a handful of plain, greasy potato chips and crushing them in your bare hands? That satisfying crunch as you sprinkled the salty fragments over the top of the creamy mixture was the best part of helping in the kitchen. When it emerged from the oven, the edges were beautifully golden and bubbling with savory goodness. The contrast between the creamy, comforting noodles and the crispy, salty chips was an absolute delight to eat. We did not care that it was a cheap meal designed to stretch $1 until it screamed. To us, sitting around the kitchen table under the warm glow of the overhead light, it was a filling masterpiece that made the entire house smell wonderful. And who could possibly forget the simple, smoky comfort of hot dogs and baked beans? Some called it beanie weenies. Others simply called it Franks and beans. This was the ultimate quick dinner when payday was still a few days away and the refrigerator was looking terribly empty. The preparation was almost wonderfully mindless. You would take a package of inexpensive hot dogs and slice them into little round coins. The knife hitting the cutting board made a steady, rhythmic tapping sound. Then, those little coins were tossed into a heavy saucepan, along with a large can of baked beans. As the pot heated up on the electric stove, the sweet, molasses-rich aroma of the beans would mix with the salty, smoky scent of the hot dogs. The sauce would thicken, turning into a dark, glossy glaze that coated every single bite. We would often eat this out of heavy ceramic bowls, sometimes sitting on the living room floor, watching our favorite evening television shows. If we were lucky, there might be a slice of buttered white bread on the side to mop up the sweet sauce left at the bottom of the bowl. It was an incredibly heavy, hearty meal that stuck to your ribs and warmed you up from the inside out. It was not glamorous, and it certainly was not gourmet, but the sweet and savory combination hit a spot that fancy restaurant food simply never could. It felt like a cozy campfire meal, brought right into our humble suburban kitchens, filling our bellies for merely pennies. Let us move on to a deeply historical dish that carried over from military mess halls right into our civilian kitchens: creamed chipped beef on toast. Many of our fathers affectionately, or perhaps notoriously, referred to this dish by its military acronym, but to us it was simply a creamy, salty plate of comfort. It was the epitome of frugal cooking. The base was just butter, flour, and milk, whisked together over low heat until it became a thick, luxurious white gravy. Then came the dried, salted beef, which came in those little glass jars. It was so salty that you had to tear it into tiny pieces before stirring it into the bubbling white sauce. The aroma was incredibly distinct, a mixture of warm dairy and sharp, cured meat. The ritual of eating it was always the same. 2 slices of plain white bread were dropped into the toaster until they were golden brown and rigid. Then the heavy, steaming gravy was ladled generously over the top. The beauty of the dish was in how the crispy toast slowly surrendered to the hot gravy, becoming soft and delightfully chewy. Every bite was a rich, salty explosion of flavor that coated your mouth. It was a true survival meal, a testament to the resilience of a generation that knew how to make a few basic ingredients feel like a heavy, satisfying dinner. When the winter wind was howling outside the windows, a hot plate of creamed chipped beef on toast made the whole world feel safe and warm inside. A true staple of our childhoods was the bright blue box of Kraft macaroni and cheese. But when it was served for dinner, it almost always came with a savory addition. We added sliced hot dogs. I can still perfectly picture that iconic box sitting on the counter. The process of making it was a childhood rite of passage. You would boil the elbow macaroni, the steam fogging up the kitchen windows. After draining the pasta, you would add a generous chunk of margarine and a splash of milk, followed by the star of the show, that little foil packet of neon orange cheese powder. The sound of the wooden spoon stirring the noodles, creating that wet, squishy noise as the powder melted into a vibrant, creamy sauce, is permanently etched in my mind. Then came the leftover hot dogs, chopped up and stirred right into the hot pot. The smoky flavor of the meat seeped into the artificial, salty cheese sauce, creating a flavor combination that was incredibly addictive. We would scoop huge, steaming portions onto our plates, the bright orange noodles contrasting beautifully with the pink chunks of hot dog. It was a meal that absolutely no one ever complained about. It was cheap, it was fast, and it felt like a special treat every single time. Even now, decades later, the smell of that powdered cheese instantly transports me back to a kitchen with linoleum floors and the sound of my siblings arguing over who got the last spoonful from the bottom of the pot. Another legendary frugal meal was the fried bologna sandwich. If you grew up in the 1970s or 1980s, you know exactly how this magical transformation worked. Cold bologna was just ordinary lunch meat, but fried bologna was something entirely different. The ritual began with cutting a few small slits around the edges of the bologna slice, or cutting one little cross right in the center. This was a crucial step to prevent the meat from curling up into a stiff cup when it hit the hot frying pan. The moment the thin meat touched the sizzling butter, the kitchen was instantly filled with a rich, savory, almost bacon-like aroma. The edges would crisp up, turning a beautiful dark brown, while the center became hot and slightly puffy. While it was still in the pan, a square of processed American cheese was quickly dropped on top, melting into a gooey blanket. It was then slid between 2 soft slices of white bread, usually slathered with bright yellow mustard or a generous spread of mayonnaise. The crunch of the pan-fried edges mixed with the soft bread and melted cheese was a textural masterpiece. It was a dinner born out of sheer necessity, often made when Mom and Dad were too tired to cook a full meal after a grueling day at work. Yet, as we bit into that hot, messy sandwich, licking the mustard off our fingers, we felt like we were eating something truly special. It was the ultimate working-class comfort food. Spaghetti with meat sauce was the undisputed king of stretching a single pound of ground beef to feed a large, hungry family. The sheer volume of food you could create for just a few dollars was astonishing. The evening would start with a massive aluminum pot of water coming to a rolling boil on the stove. I remember the sharp snap of the long, stiff spaghetti noodles as Mom broke them in half to fit them into the bubbling water. In a scarce saucepan, she would brown whatever small amount of ground beef we could afford, crumbling it into tiny pieces so that it would spread out evenly. Then she would pour in a large glass jar of store-bought marinara sauce, or if she had the time, canned crushed tomatoes with dried oregano and garlic powder. The sauce would simmer slowly, the red bubbles popping and splashing the stovetop, filling the air with the sweet, acidic scent of tomatoes and herbs. When dinner was served, the plates were piled impossibly high with pale noodles, topped with a modest ladle of the red meat sauce. We would meticulously twirl the spaghetti onto our forks, making sure to get one little piece of ground beef in every single bite. Sometimes, if we were lucky, there was a green cardboard canister of powdery Parmesan cheese to shake over the top. It was a loud, messy, wonderful meal. It brought everyone together at the table, slurping noodles and wiping red sauce off our chins, completely unaware of the strict budget that made the meal possible. Friday nights often meant one specific, highly anticipated frozen dinner: fish sticks and crispy tater tots. This was the ultimate treat for a kid in the 1980s. You would hear the crinkling of the frozen plastic bags being pulled from the icy depths of the freezer. The oven would preheat, warming up the entire kitchen on a chilly evening. The fish sticks, perfectly rectangular and coated in thick breadcrumbs, were carefully laid out on a metal baking sheet alongside rows of frozen cylindrical potatoes. As they baked, the house would fill with the comforting, salty scent of fried breading and hot potatoes. The anticipation was almost too much to handle. When Mom pulled the tray out of the oven, the fish sticks were a beautiful golden brown, and the tater tots were hot and remarkably crispy on the outside. We would squirt massive, ridiculous puddles of bright red ketchup onto our plates for dipping. The contrast between the crunchy exterior of the fish stick and the soft, flaky white fish inside was delightful. We would eat them with our fingers, dipping the hot tater tots into the cold ketchup, enjoying the simple, greasy perfection of a processed meal. It was often the dinner we ate while watching our favorite Friday night cartoons or sitcoms, sitting shoulder to shoulder on the brown plaid couch. It was purely joyful, completely unpretentious food that perfectly captured the innocent spirit of our childhood weekends. Let us take a moment to remember the interactive magic of shake and bake. Cooking dinner was usually an adult chore, but this specific meal allowed us children to get involved in the most fun way possible. The process was a deeply ingrained household ritual. Mom would open the cardboard box and pull out a clear plastic bag and a foil packet of heavily seasoned breadcrumbs. The smell of the open packet was intensely savory, a strong mix of paprika, garlic powder, and dried herbs. She would place a few inexpensive pork chops or cheap pieces of chicken into the bag, pour in the crumbs, and then twist the top closed. And then came the magic words: "It is your turn to shake." We would grab that bag and shake it with all our might, watching as the pale, raw meat became perfectly coated in the orange and brown spices. It felt like we were performing a culinary miracle. When the meat came out of the oven, it had a miraculously crispy, flavorful crust that tasted just like it had been deep fried, even though it had only been baked. The meat inside was juicy and hot, pairing perfectly with a side of simple canned corn or instant mashed potatoes. We ate those pork chops with an immense sense of pride, knowing that our vigorous shaking had contributed to this delicious family dinner. It turned a very cheap cut of meat into a crispy, flavorful delight. And more importantly, it turned cooking into a beautiful moment of family bonding. Deeply rooted in the rural and working-class traditions of America was the incredibly humble pot of pinto beans and cornbread. This was a meal that took time, patience, and almost no money at all. The ritual began the night before, when the dry, hard beans were poured into a bowl of water to soak. By morning, they had swelled up, ready for the heavy cast-iron pot. Mom would let those beans simmer on the back burner for the entire day. She would throw in a smoky ham hock, or just some bacon grease she saved in a tin can under the sink, to give the broth a deep, rich flavor. The earthy, savory scent of those cooking beans would seep into the walls, the curtains, and the very soul of the house. By dinner time, the beans were incredibly soft, swimming in a thick, dark brown gravy. But the meal was never complete without the cornbread. Baked in a searing hot black cast-iron skillet, the cornbread had a perfectly crispy, buttery crust and a soft, crumbly center. We would take large, hot wedges of that yellow bread and crumble it directly into our deep bowls of beans. The sweet and savory bread would soak up the smoky broth, creating a heavy, porridge-like texture that was unimaginably comforting. It was peasant food, pure and simple, yet it provided a profound sense of warmth and fullness. Eating a bowl of beans and cornbread felt like receiving a tight, warm hug from a grandmother who knew exactly how to make you feel loved. Another iconic dish born from the necessity to stretch ingredients was American goulash. Now, this was not the traditional, complex European stew. This was a distinctly American, one-pot wonder that utilized whatever was lingering in the pantry. It usually started with browning a small amount of ground beef and a chopped yellow onion. Then came the inexpensive macaroni noodles, poured dry right into the same pot. Mom would open large cans of diced tomatoes, tomato sauce, and sometimes a can of sweet yellow corn, dumping them all together. A splash of water, a pinch of salt and pepper, and a lid went on top. The magic happened as the mixture slowly simmered. You could hear the heavy, wet, bubbling sound from beneath the lid. The dry macaroni absorbed the seasoned tomato juices and the savory beef fat, expanding and softening. When she finally lifted the lid, the steam would billow out, carrying a rich, sweet, and beefy aroma that made your mouth water instantly. She would stir it with a heavy wooden spoon, the thick stew making a satisfying, sloshing sound. Served in deep bowls, American goulash was thick, hearty, and incredibly filling. The soft noodles and sweet tomatoes provided a wonderful contrast to the savory meat. It was the absolute perfect dinner for a freezing Tuesday night in January, warming us from the inside out and providing enough leftovers to feed us again the very next day. It was frugal engineering at its absolute finest. Sometimes the absolute best frugal dinner was one that broke all the traditional rules. I am talking about breakfast for dinner. When the grocery budget was practically empty and payday was just a little too far away, Mom would declare it a pancake night. The sheer excitement we felt as children was immeasurable. It felt like a wonderful rebellion. The kitchen would suddenly smell like Saturday morning on a Wednesday evening. The sweet scent of vanilla extract and wet batter filled the air. We would listen to the sharp sizzle of butter melting onto the hot electric griddle. Mom would pour the batter into perfect little circles, and we would eagerly watch for the tiny bubbles to form on the surface, signaling it was time to flip. The golden brown discs were stacked high on our plates. We would slather them with more margarine and drown them in thick, artificial maple syrup from a plastic squeeze bottle. The sugary syrup would soak into the porous pancakes, making every bite incredibly sweet, warm, and heavy. There might have been a few cheap sausage links on the side to provide a salty contrast, but the pancakes were the undeniable star. Having breakfast for dinner made us forget that we were eating it because we had no money for meat or vegetables. It felt like a celebration, a cozy, sweet escape from the normal routine, wrapping the whole family in a blanket of sugary comfort. Let us not forget the humble, savory delight of Salisbury steak. Whether it came out of a frozen foil tray or was shaped by hand from the cheapest ground beef, it felt like an attempt to bring a fancy restaurant meal into our modest dining rooms. When made from scratch, it was the ultimate meat stretcher. Mom would take a pound of ground beef and mix it with a heavy dose of breadcrumbs, an egg, and a packet of dry onion soup mix. She would form them into oval patties, frying them until they had a dark, caramelized crust. The kitchen would smell intensely of roasted onions and frying beef. But the true soul of Salisbury steak was the gravy. A thick, dark brown mushroom gravy was poured generously over the patties, simmering until the meat was tender and infused with that earthy flavor. It was almost always served alongside a towering scoop of instant mashed potatoes. The flakes from the cardboard box were magically transformed with hot water and milk into a fluffy white mountain. We would use our forks to press a little crater into the center of the potatoes, filling it to the brim with that rich, dark gravy. The soft, savory meat easily broke apart with just a fork, blending perfectly with the creamy potatoes. It was an incredibly heavy, sleepy kind of meal. It provided a deep, satisfying fullness that made you want to lean back in your chair and sigh with absolute contentment. There was a meal that was the undisputed cure for a rainy day, a bad mood, or a completely empty wallet. A hot bowl of condensed tomato soup served alongside a buttery, gooey grilled cheese sandwich. The visual contrast alone was beautiful. The bright, vibrant red of the soup next to the golden, crispy brown of the bread. It began with that iconic red and white can. The thick, gelatinous red paste was plopped into a saucepan, usually mixed with a can of milk instead of water to make it creamier. As it heated, the sweet, acidic aroma of tomatoes filled the room. Meanwhile, the grilled cheese was being perfectly crafted. Soft white bread, heavily buttered on the outside, with a single slice of bright orange American cheese in the middle. The sizzle of the buttered bread hitting the hot frying pan is a sound I will never forget. Mom would press it down with a spatula, ensuring an even, crispy crust. When it was served, the sandwich was always cut diagonally into two perfect triangles. The ritual was mandatory. You had to take that crispy triangle and dip the pointed end directly into the steaming hot tomato soup. The buttery crust would absorb the sweet red liquid, softening just a bit before you took a bite. The combination of the hot, tangy soup and the rich melted cheese was a sensory triumph. It was the purest form of culinary comfort, wrapping you up like a warm, familiar blanket. For a fun, interactive dinner that cost mere pennies, nothing beat the excitement of English muffin pizzas. This was another meal where the children were promoted to assistant chefs. A package of English muffins was carefully split open, revealing those famous nooks and crannies. We would lay the pale, round halves onto a baking sheet, completely mesmerized by the task ahead. Usually a small spoon, we would smear a thick layer of bright red pizza sauce from a glass jar onto each half, watching as the sauce seeped down into the little holes. Next came the shredded mozzarella cheese, carefully pinched and dropped over the top, making sure every inch of the red sauce was covered. If we had any leftover pepperoni in the fridge, we would proudly place 3 little circles on top of the cheese. They went into the oven, or sometimes just the small toaster oven on the counter, and we would wait impatiently. The smell of baking bread, melting cheese, and oregano slowly filled the kitchen. When they came out, the cheese was bubbling and dotted with golden brown spots. We always burned the roof of our mouths because we could never wait long enough for them to cool down. The bottom of the muffin was incredibly crunchy, while the top was soft and gooey. It was our version of a pizzeria, created right there on our faded Formica countertops, providing endless joy for an incredibly small amount of money. Do you remember the specific, comforting weight of a frozen chicken pot pie sitting in your hands? Those little aluminum tins held an absolute treasure of cheap, savory goodness. In the 1980s, popping a few frozen pot pies into the oven was a weekly savior for exhausted parents. The baking time always felt like an eternity. For nearly an hour, the kitchen would slowly fill with the mouth-watering scent of baking pastry dough, roasted chicken, and rich, savory gravy. When they were finally pulled from the oven, the top crust was a beautiful, hard, golden dome. Eating a pot pie required a very specific technique. You would take your spoon and crack the center of the crust. The sound was a sharp, satisfying crunch, instantly followed by a massive plume of fragrant, hot steam rising into the air. Inside was a bubbling, thick yellow gravy suspended with small cubes of chicken, soft, bright orange carrots, and pale green peas. You had to blow on your single spoonful to avoid burning your tongue, but the flavor was worth the risk. The contrast between the flaky, buttery pieces of crust and the heavy, savory filling was pure perfection. We would carefully scrape the sides of the little aluminum tin to make sure we did not miss a single drop of that incredible gravy. It was a self-contained miniature feast that made a weeknight feel cozy and thoroughly satisfying. Let us talk about a dish that is the very definition of hearty, working-class resilience: cabbage and kielbasa. It is a meal deeply rooted in Eastern European traditions, but it became a frugal staple in American kitchens across the country. The ingredients were incredibly cheap, but the flavor profile was remarkably complex. The cooking process was loud and deeply aromatic. Mom would chop a massive head of pale green cabbage into thick ribbons. In a large skillet, she would fry up slices of inexpensive smoked kielbasa, or whatever smoked sausage was on sale that week. The sound of the fat rendering in the pan was a loud, aggressive sizzle. The smoky, garlicky aroma of the meat would permeate the entire house. She would remove the sausage and drop the mountain of raw cabbage and sliced white onions directly into that savory fat. Slowly, the stiff cabbage would wilt and soften, absorbing all the incredible flavors left in the pan. The smell transformed from sharp and raw to incredibly sweet and savory. When the sausage was added back in, it created a massive steaming pile of food that cost almost nothing. Served on a simple plate, the soft, sweet, caramelized cabbage perfectly balanced the salty, snappy bite of the smoked sausage. It was undeniably peasant food, heavy and rustic, but to us, chewing on those sweet and savory bites, it tasted like absolute royalty. Sometimes an entire dinner was built around the simplest, cheapest vegetable in the pantry, the baked potato. But we did not just serve it as a small side dish. In times of tight budgets, the loaded baked potato was the main event. Mom would take massive russet potatoes, scrub their rough, earthy skins in the sink, and poke them a few times with a metal fork. Often she would wrap them tightly in shiny aluminum foil before placing them directly onto the oven racks. They would bake for over an hour, the house slowly taking on that warm, earthy scent of roasting potatoes. The anticipation built as we waited for them to soften. When they were ready, Mom would unwrap the foil, careful not to burn her fingers on the trapped steam. She would slice the top open and give the ends a firm squeeze, forcing the fluffy, bright white interior to burst upward. Then came the toppings. We would load them with thick pats of yellow margarine that instantly melted into golden pools. We added heavy dashes of salt and black pepper. If we were lucky, there might be a dollop of sour cream or a spoonful of leftover chili from a few nights before. Eating it was a slow, deliberate process. We scraped the soft, buttery potato from the tough skin, savoring the starchy, comforting warmth. It was a massive, heavy meal that cost pennies, filling our bellies and forcing us into a deep, contented slumber. No list of frugal 1980s dinners would be complete without mentioning the absolute king of stretching ground beef, the classic American meatloaf. This was an exercise in culinary ingenuity. To make a single pound of meat feed a family of 5 or 6, you had to add fillers. Mom would stand at the counter, her hands deep in a cold glass bowl, mixing the raw ground beef with wet breadcrumbs or sometimes dry rolled oats, diced onions, and an egg to bind it all together. The mixture was firmly packed into a glass loaf pan. But the absolute best part of the meatloaf was the glaze. A thick, generous layer of plain ketchup was squeezed over the top before it went into the oven. As it baked, the smell of roasting meat and onions filled the kitchen, but it was the ketchup that performed magic. It slowly caramelized in the heat, turning into a sticky, dark red, sweet and savory crust that sealed the meatloaf. When she pulled it out, the edges were bubbling with rendered fat. She would slice it thick, the steam rising from the hot, tender meat. The savory flavor of the beef mixed with the sweet, caramelized ketchup was incredibly comforting. We always hoped there would be leftovers because a cold meatloaf sandwich on white bread with a little extra ketchup the next day was arguably even better than the dinner itself. It was the ultimate comfort food for a frugal family. Finally, we arrive at the absolute simplest, most humble meal of them all. When the cabinets were truly bare, when the budget was stretched to its absolute breaking point at the end of a hard month, Mom would make cinnamon toast. It sounds like a breakfast or a small snack, but sometimes this sweet treat was our actual dinner. And let me tell you, we never felt poor when we ate it. We felt incredibly lucky. The ritual was deeply soothing. Slices of plain white bread were toasted until they were warm and slightly rigid. Mom would quickly spread a thick layer of soft butter over the hot bread, watching it melt instantly, seeping into the pores of the toast. Then she would take a small shaker filled with a mixture of white granulated sugar and ground cinnamon. She would generously dust the buttered toast, the sweet, spicy aroma of the cinnamon hitting the warm air. The sugar would mix with the melted butter, creating a slightly gritty, sweet, heavenly crust on top of the bread. We would sit at the kitchen table, the house quiet, eating our sweet, warm toast with a cold glass of milk. It was a meal that spoke volumes without a single word. It was a mother's way of providing warmth, comfort, and a little bit of sweetness when the world outside was harsh and unforgiving. Chewing on that cinnamon toast, we knew we were safe, and we knew we were deeply, deeply loved. As we look back at these 20 incredibly frugal meals from the 1980s, a beautiful truth reveals itself. We do not just miss the taste of the sloppy joes or the crunch of the potato chips on a tuna casserole. We are mourning the loss of a specific feeling. We miss our youth. We miss the slow, deliberate pace of the evening. We miss the comforting voices of our parents echoing in a warm kitchen that smelled of onions and butter. We miss sitting shoulder to shoulder with our siblings, completely unbothered by the fact that our meal cost less than a few dollars to make. These modest, inexpensive dinners nourished our bodies, but more importantly, the love and sacrifice folded into every recipe nourished our souls. They taught us that true wealth is not found in expensive ingredients, but in who is sitting across the table from you. If this warm journey down memory lane brought a smile to your face, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a like on this video. It truly helps us keep these precious memories alive. Now, I want to hear your story. What was the absolute best frugal struggle meal your family made when you were growing up? Please write your memories down in the comments below. We want to read them, remember with you, and celebrate the beautiful, humble history of our dining tables.